welcome back to the Spiritual Reality Podcast. This week has been wild. There's a lot of things going on that I could have really touched on. Some of the things, President Trump signed an executive order about IVF, and that's a huge debate right now out on Twitter or X as far as in the Christian world. And I think I would like to get into that at some point. I'm not quite ready to do that. Then also, Vice President J.D. Vance really kind of jumped in with both feet, speaking over in Europe about free speech and how that is really being limited right now over there. And so, I could have jumped into that. We've already done a podcast on free speech as well. But again, really big topic. Another thing that happened over the last week that was really interesting was the tweet by Pastor Rick Warren, where he talked about Jesus hanging between the two thieves on the cross. And he said that, on all these issues in culture, you'll always find Jesus in the middle, basically. I don't remember the exact quote. And I was thinking about handling that, but then he actually came out and said, I didn't mean that the way it sounded. So anyhow, what I would like to do today is I'd like to dive into something that has occupied philosophers and theologians for centuries. This concept, does God exist, and how do we prove it? And you may have friends that struggle with that idea. You may struggle with how you would answer that. Or maybe you just always assume that God exists, and you just kind of feel like, well, I don't really need to know how to give an answer for that. I mean, obviously God exists. But if somebody asks you, how do you know? You would really have a hard time knowing what to say. And so let's jump into some of these arguments. It's going to be a little more thinking, so stick with me. And let's dive through these. Now, the first thing is when we talk about proofs for God's existence, we need to understand that we're not talking about scientific proof like proving gravity. Some people get hung up on that. They'll only accept the idea of God if they can touch it and test it and see it, right? And so when you're proving something like this, you're looking at the evidence that points to it, and you're determining what's the most logical conclusion. And so these are philosophical and logical arguments that attempt to make the case for a divine being. So let's start with one of the classics, which is the cosmological argument. These are big fancy words, but just stick with me. So as we think about the cosmological argument, imagine a line of dominoes, and one falls, knocking over the next one, and the next one, the next one, and so on. But how did the first domino fall? Something caused it to fall. The cosmological argument basically says that everything in the universe has a cause, and that there must have been a first cause, and that first cause has to be an uncaused cause, or else it would also need a cause. Now, why does it have to be an uncaused cause? Because everything in the natural world has a cause. So there must be something outside the realm of nature, outside space and time and matter, not subject to any natural laws, that could have caused everything. And that uncaused cause is by definition God. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century elaborated on this, suggesting that this first cause must be powerful, eternal, and intelligent. The interesting thing about this argument is that it's the only reasonable solution to this issue of first cause. So by its very nature, science cannot offer a solution, because we would just keep going further and further back and saying, what caused that, what caused that, what caused that? And so the ultimate start has to have been caused by something outside of the realm of nature, outside of the laws of nature, and never have been caused. So let's move on to another famous one, the teleological argument, sometimes called the argument from design. And this one really focuses on the order and complexity of the universe. Now think about the intricate workings of a watch. It's so complex, right? With all its parts are working together, that it seems impossible that it could have come about by just chance, right? I mean, even if all the parts, the right parts, which, I mean, that's a thing in itself, that all the right parts that could possibly fit together would be laying in a pile, the fact that somehow they would have organized themselves would be amazing. And so there must have been a watchmaker. The teleological argument applies to the universe. When you think about it, the universe is so finely tuned, so perfectly designed for life, it must have had a designer. Now, there are a million great examples to point to in nature, like the human eye or the incredible efficiency of photosynthesis. And critics try to argue that evolution by natural selection can explain the apparent design in the universe without needing a divine designer. And there are several problems with that, the idea that these complex systems evolved naturally. First of all, so many systems have irreducible complexity, and so they're irreducibly complex. And so an eye that hasn't yet evolved a retina is useless. So many things have to come together to work perfectly for you to be able to see. The idea that each of those systems developed slowly over time and eventually happened to come together with no intelligent direction is frankly impossible. But the other problem is the Darwinian concept of survival of the fittest. Do you have time for an eye to develop, for all of the systems inside of an eye to come together? You have time for all of that to evolve and develop while maybe other species can already see. You're just going to be easy prey during that time. You're not going to be the fittest. Evolution suggests that birds evolved from lizards, right? How did they survive the transition? That's my question. So you have these principles of survival of the fittest, but then you also have this idea that you've got transitional forms that can't run very fast anymore, but can't fly yet. They're not the fittest. They're dead meat, right? They're just easy prey. And so how would they survive to keep reproducing until they fully transition? The answer is pretty simple. They wouldn't. And that's why we have to have millions and billions and billions of years. And Eric Hovind talked about that last week on the podcast. That's why they have to have that, because in order for this much design to have happened by accident, then you just need an infinite amount of time. And so let's also touch on the moral argument. This one focuses on our sense of right and wrong. Where does morality come from? Why do we have this innate sense of justice and fairness and compassion? Why do we have this? The moral argument suggests that these moral values couldn't have come from evolution or social conditioning alone. They must have a divine source. Evolution sees us as just a collection of evolving molecules and mutations. There's no morality in that. So the physical world does not produce a sense of morality. If we're all just on a journey of the survival of the fittest, why can't I murder whoever I want to, right? If I'm stronger than them, shouldn't my line continue and theirs shouldn't? Right? I mean, that's what survival of the fittest is. Of course, we all know that murder is objectively wrong, but why do we know that? Why do we seem to have this sense about us that animals don't have? If there's a universal sense of moral law, there must be a lawgiver that designed us with that sense, and evolution cannot produce that. There's one more argument that frankly is often not thrown in with all these lofty logical concepts, and I think it's the strongest argument of all. Let's just call this the historical argument. All of these other arguments kind of depend on logic, and they're pretty airtight. I think these are great arguments, by the way. But there's one argument that depends on historical facts, the facts surrounding Jesus Christ. Reliable historical evidence shows that a man showed up in the first century who claimed to be God, died, and rose again to prove that he's everything he said he was. And even saying when he lived is a historical fact when you think about it, because he's the reason we call it the first century. Right? After he came, we started keeping time based on when he showed up. And many times atheists want to demand that if God is real, then why won't he show up and reveal himself? They'll often demand, they'll be in a debate and they'll look at the Christian that they're debating, and they'll say, if God is real, I dare him to show up right now and prove himself. Well, first of all, that's super arrogant, that you can just demand when and how God is supposed to reveal himself. But secondly, he already did. And you don't believe the historical evidence. Romans chapter 1 says that just from nature we can see that there's a God and that we're accountable to him, right? But God went way beyond that by showing up here on earth. And there was clearly something divine going on with Jesus, or we never would have heard of this carpenter turned untrained rabbi turned crucified enemy of the state. I mean, you think about it, there's nothing about his life that would make him memorable to the point that we would start keeping time based on his arrival. He's a carpenter, son of a carpenter, ends up being a untrained rabbi, just traveling from here to there. Like he didn't sit under anybody else. He just kind of under his own authority. In that Jewish culture, that would be a nobody. That would be kind of a kook. It would be like who does this guy think he is? He didn't come up through all the proper educational system. He didn't sit under somebody else. And so people would have generally not paid him any attention, except that he was going around healing people and working miracles. Like, it got people's attention. But then ultimately he's crucified as an enemy of the state. Do you know how many religious people came and went and, maybe even were crucified or given the death penalty or stoned to death for blasphemy? Like so many of those people came and went, and we don't know their names. If he hadn't risen from the dead, we would have never heard anything about him. And yet we keep time based on his life. The greatest proof of God is Jesus Christ. When you look at all the other arguments that we've looked at, which are very powerful arguments, and then you see that God that we feel accountable to, that has given us this sense of morality, that has designed everything that we see, when you put all of that with the fact that, and actually he showed up and engaged us and died on the cross for us and rose again, and you look at the historical facts of that, the proofs for God are unbelievable. So there you have it. It's a whirlwind tour. There's also the ontological argument. I'm not going to get into that. It's really heady, but I encourage you to look it up. But that's just kind of a whirlwind tour of the most influential proofs of the existence of God. Which one do you think is the most convincing? Love to hear from you. Thanks for joining me today on the Spiritual Reality Podcast. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Join the conversation on our social media channels. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode. And we'll see you next Friday. Remember, if you're not living by what God says, you're not living in reality.